Hi guys, welcome to Code Decode. Today in this video, we are going to cover some Mockito JUnit interview questions.
Please like, share and subscribe to support us, and we are setting a like target of 500 likes.
In the previous video, we have already covered how to mock your dependencies. So here, we want to test employee service IMPL, but it has a dependency of employee CRUD repository. Now, I don't want to call the database directly or hit the database at any cost. So I have to mock this dependency. So we have already seen how to mock and how to inject mock in the previous video. With a quick overview, let's see what is Mockito in JUnit. So Mockito is a Java-based mocking framework for unit testing of Java applications. So it is used for mocking in Java. It is used in conjunction with other testing frameworks such as JUnit and TestNG. Currently we are covering JUnits. We'll focus on TestNG if I'll get some requirement in the comment section. Then only I will cover the TestNG. The most of the time, what the famous framework for unit testing is JUnit for us in Java. It internally uses Java Reflection API in order to create mock objects for the given interface. Now here if you can see, we have created the mock object of employee repository. Now you will ask me, how does it internally works? How is this possible that this CRUD repository is a mocked object? If you can see, this is a Mockito interceptor and this is a mock. So basically the real call to this method will not go at all at line number 23. So how does we create this mock object? What internally happens in this @mock? So what internally happens is, for this particular employee CRUD repo, the reflection is used and a mirror image for this repository is created using the reflection at runtime to create the mock object of repository. The mock objects are nothing but a proxy of actual implementation. So this was the actual implementation, and when the actual code used to run, it used to actually hit the database and used to find an employee with the ID 1. But when it is mocked, the reflection API of Java is used and the real call to this repository does not happen at all. Rather than the mock of this employee CRUD is created for us. To add it, just add this dependency and you will be good to go. Now what is mocking? Mocking is a process of developing the objects that acts as a clone of the real object. So what is mocking? We are creating a clone of CRUD repo. If you can over here, this is a mocked or the cloned object of CRUD repo and real CRUD repo is not called. Mocking is a testing technique where mock objects are used instead of real object for testing purpose. Since we don't want to call the real database and hence the mocked object of database is called and the dummy is used. The mock object provides the dummy output for a particular dummy input passed to it. Now in real world, when we pass an employee ID 1, the database is hit. This is our database. So here code 1 at the ID 1, the code is returned. So if this would have been the case, the E should have been the employee object retrieved from this table. But in reality, dummy object is created and the dummy input is passed. So when we pass a dummy input, a dummy output is created. How do we do that? With a when and then mantra. So when your repository is to be called with find by ID, then always return a stub object. So this is the stub object, this is a dummy object. So we have created a stub object like this here explicitly and not by hitting the database. So for a dummy input, a dummy output is passed. Mockito in unit testing is when you create the repository that implements the behavior of real repository in a controlled way. So it is not, the mocked object is also a repository but in a controlled way where we tell them that when this particular call goes, do not hit the database, rather return my stub object. So this is the control that we have over the mocked objects. In short, mocks are used for replacing for a dependency. So here if you can see, the employee service IMPL has an auto-wired dependency of repository. So always mock all those dependency that you do not want to have a real call. To mock objects, you need to understand the concepts. Stub, fake, spy, dummy and mock. All of these will be useful when you are unit testing the code. But when it comes to Mockito, only mock is usually used. So we'll be focusing on mock, and if you want to know about stub, fake, spy and dummy, let me know in the comment section. I'll invoke that code also for you. The method invoked using the mocked reference will not execute the actual code. So here the actual code will not be hit. That means the database will not be hit. Rather, the method behavior is configured using when and then return methods. Here we have used when. This particular method is called then return my stub object rather than the one from the database. So the real call will never go through the database, but it will be configured using the then and then mantra. We have already seen what is @mock and what is @inject mock. So @mocks creates the mock, and @inject creates the actual object and inject the mock dependency into it. So inject mock was the one that we have to test. So service IMPL is our inject mock. It creates the actual object. So yes, employee service IMPL, the real call goes to this method. If you can see, my debugger is actually here. So real call goes to inject mock, but @mock, the real call will not go to any of this particular repository. Rather, a mocked object is created with when and then here. So we must define the when and then return method for mocked object, whose class will be invoked during the actual test execution. So in a unit test case, when you create an object of a class that needs to be tested, its method to be invoked using inject mock. Something similar that we have already done in the previous video. Always do the inject mock for those classes that you need to test, and create the mock for the dependencies present in that particular environment, which you do not want to give a real call to complete that dependency. So here repository is to be mocked because real call is not to be done here in the repository. Now, what is the benefit of mocking? Why do you use Mockito at all in your application? The reason is, first, the hard coding is not there, is not required. So here you have to create your own repository, a whole own test database, and hit that database to fetch the employee with ID 1. Rather than doing all those stuff and hard coding everything and creating a complete new test database and hard coding everything into it, why not let's just mock it up? So no need to write the mock object or your own, or a new database on your own. Just use the mock one, and it will automatically will not give a call to find by ID at all if you have implemented it properly like this. Secondly, refactor safe. So what if I have not mocked it? Rather, I have created my own database. Now, what if my employee table changes? I have to change my test database employee object table also. So which is a headache to me. So rather than doing that, renaming anything in or even reordering the parameters of employee table in the main database will also affect your test database. So by using the mocking, you don't have to create any new database. Rather, you can just mock your repository. So it will not break your test code, as mocks are created at runtime using Java Reflection API. We have seen that mocks are actually, so this repository, the mock repository is created at runtime using the reflection. Return value is supported. So Mockito always supports the return values and also supports the exceptions. So we have seen how it handles the return value. Here in this particular find by ID, returns you an employee object. So how did we handle it? Using when and then return. Also we have when then throw. So I can show you how. So when this particular method is called, you can, rather than returning, you can also throw a particular exception. So that's the then throw for you. So it not only supports the return value but also supports the exception if you want to throw one. The order of check is also supported. So which method is called first and which after that is to be supported in Mockito also. I'll show that to you later part in this video. Annotation supports. So yes, mocking do is supported with annotations. We have done everything with annotations only, that is mock and inject mock here. So annotations are supported by Mockito. Now, what a disadvantage of using Mockito in your application? So, Mockito cannot mock everything out of the box. If you think, oh my god, now whatever comes in my path, I'll mock everything. Whatever dependency comes in my path, I'll mock everything and my life is so good. No, that doesn't happen. Why? Because you cannot mock final and static methods. The equals method or the construction of object cannot be mocked. Now, if that cannot be done, is there any way Java provides you, or Mockito provides you with some method with which you can mock these final and static methods, the equal method or the construction of an object? Yes, for that we have Power Mockito, and Power Mock will always mock even such kind of complex things also for you. But if a design is good, I don't believe we mostly needs the Power Mockito. I'll never suggest you to go towards that because it is a very powerful way of mocking. So if your task is done by just Mockito, then go for Mockito until unless you don't have the complex situations of having the dependency which is final and static. So don't do that until unless really necessary. Now the next question can be, why do you need mocking at the first place itself? Why do you need Mockito in your application? What task have you accomplished with mocking? Why don't you just let your database be hit with the value. So if I don't mock it and just directly hit the database with ID 1, will you not get the data? Yes, you will get the data. Then why do you really need to mock it? What is the need of it? So there are few situations where you actually need the mocking and you don't want the real call to be established when testing your JUnits. The very first thing is that we have taken an example of, that is database connections. Sometimes the database query can take 10, 20 or even more seconds to execute. Now I know that just with one single method, I can write 2 to 3 methods just to JUnit test case each line. So if for one method, suppose I have 3 JUnits written to completely test all the scenarios in a particular method, then hitting the database thrice for same method doesn't make sense, because it will be time consuming and it will waste your memory, CPU time, everything. So hitting the database every time for each of the just the test casing of your few scenarios doesn't make sense to create a database connection every time. Now, you can also mock those classes that are slow. So, there can be a case that some class is not performance intensive. They are very slow. They take a lot of time to complete a single method. Then you should always mock that class so that you can quickly just test your feature and get out of that scope of JUnit. And why do we need to quickly complete the JUnit test cases? Because in the CICD pipeline, all your test cases run before your code is actually pushed to the repository, the dev or the prod repository. In that case, your build will keep on going for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes if your test cases are slow. So always have performance effective, less time consuming JUnit test cases in your applications. Now, classes with side effects should also be mocked. Like, for example, on a particular situation, I send emails to client. Now, to test a particular functionality, do you really need to keep on sending the client's email? This will be confusing for clients. Like, if that particular thing is not happening, why am I getting the emails? So, if you are just testing a functionality to send an email, better to test your functionality and mock the call that sends the email to the clients. Do not send the emails to the client just because you want to test your functionality. Don't do that. If you want to test a component that depends upon another component, but it is under development. Now, if I am the person working on some task, I want to test a component, but that component is with another person in my development team and he is working on it. So, will I wait for his development complete and then test my code? Rather than doing that, a call that goes to his code can be mocked easily. So without mocking, I have to wait for completion of his task before I can JUnit test case my functionality. So rather than waiting for the development completion, I'll not wait, I'll mock his call and I'll check my functionality thoroughly. It will be his task to test his functionality. So anyways, the task will be done at the end. A very important scenario where I want to mock is when using microservices. When one call goes to another microservice, does some task there in return with a response. Till then, will my web service be waiting for the response for just a JUnit test cases for testing a feature? No, for such REST API calls or gRPC calls, rather mock those such calls to the external system or the external web service, because connecting to an external service can take too much time. Even there can be a case that the REST API is down. That will impact our testing because we are not wrong. Our functionality is working perfectly fine. But the web service that we are trying to call from our application is down. So just because of them, our test case should not fail. So always mock the external system calls, because even your CI/CD pipeline will break if another web service is down. So even if you are perfectly fine up and running, just because of another web service, your CI/CD will break and your manager will be on your head why your service JUnits are breaking. You have to then again debug whole reason why the JUnit failed, and the real response comes that no, the issue was not from our side but from the external resource. So rather than going through all such kinds of conversions, you better mock whatever things you can mock around, because the testing the functionality of that particular web service is not your task. It's not your web service or the microservice task. It is their task. They will do it on their own. So just don't complicate around. Just use Mockito and keep things simple at your end. Now, a very important part, what is JUnit coverage? So nowadays in any Java project, if you write any number of lines of code, 80% coverage is minimum required. Now, how will you check whether your JUnit code coverage is good? So here you can go to Marketplace. I have already installed this coverage, JUnit coverage. Now what you have to install is this IMA Java code coverage 3.1.6. This is a free code coverage tool for Eclipse. You will also have almost the same for the IntelliJ. You can search around in the Eclipse or the IntelliJ marketplace and you will find one code coverage, Java code coverage tool. I'm going to use this tool. When it is installed, it looks like something like this. Now, how would you test how much code coverage is there in your application? So, coverage is JUnit test case. Now it will load whole the context and will all run all the test cases you have in your application. Currently, we have just one method and hence it shows no, it's not even near to 80%. If you have these many lines of code, you should have 80% of coverage. Currently, I can see just 2 line of code is covered. So this code will not pass your 80% JUnit coverage parameter and your build will be failed. So to cover it, I'll create one more test method in the same class and I want to test get employee by ID test with exception. When this particular method is called, if the name is code, then an exception will be thrown. Now these 2 lines are already covered. I just want to cover this line. So while creating the stub, I'll create one more method of creating stub with an exception and will pass the name as code. And I'll call this method here. So whenever a repository is called, then return it with code. Now when it is returned with a code, this if condition runs true and these 3 lines will be executed and it will throw an exception. If that is the case, then I cannot assert equals that my name is code. What I can do is I can assert throws. So just like assert equals, I have assert throws. And what exception will be thrown? The exception thrown will be business exception dot class. So this business exception dot class will be thrown. And when it will be thrown? So lambda expression is used here. It will be thrown when employee service IMPL is called with employee ID 1 and it will return you a business exception. When this find by ID with 1 is called, it is going to return you an employee with code because it is a stubbed one. I have written the stubbed one. So the stubbed with exception is returned and it will pass this if condition of this and all the 3 lines will be executed. But at the end, a new exception will be thrown. So we will assert equals that this business exception dot get message is the one that we have passed here. So what is the message that we have passed here? Not allowed to access this employee. So I'm going to check whether this message is there or not. So let me debug this for you now. So here we have mocked our repository and we are going to call this method. While calling this method, let me put a debugger here. And now here I pass an employee ID as 1. But the one that is to be returned here is code. So if you can see, the name is code that we have written from our stub object. So this goes true and a business exception is thrown. When business exception is thrown, the JUnit is passed. Why? Because in the JUnit we have tested assert equals. The message is passed as not allowed to access the employee object. So yes, not allowed to access the employee object is only the message that has been passed to this particular business exception. So hence assert equals is true and our the code runs perfectly fine. Now if I try to run it with the code coverage as coverage configuration and I'm going to test it with employee service IMPL. So not only just a project, you can also test your individual class. So my employee service IMPL is a class that is to be tested for code coverage. So I can click on this employee service IMPL test class and now the whole context will run. And it will show you what all the lines of code are there which is not tested. So great. With 2 methods, you have tested all the scenarios. One scenario when the name is not code and one scenario where the name is code. So this is all done. But now still no such element exception is still not covered. So for that, now we are going to use third method and that is, we have seen the when and then mantra, right? So when and then return mantra. Now we will see when and then throw mantra. So when this will throw a no such element exception, it will be catched here and it is again going to throw it. In that case, our test case will run and also cover these 3 lines of code. Let's see quickly how to see that. Before that, let me clear this code coverage so that it cannot mislead you. So removing it will remove it. Now similar to this, I'll write another test case with, this is a new exception. The exception will be no such element exception. So I can write exception 2, just the naming convention, exception 1 and exception 2. Or you can write even an exception of business exception, get employee by ID with business exception and get employee by ID with no such element exception. Here, when repository is to be called at line number 23, I want the code, this is already tested. So I don't want to test all this code. So I can directly throw no such element exception. So when repository is called, then rather than return, then please throw. And what are we going to throw? New, no such element exception. So whenever this line number 23 is going to be executed, a no such element exception will be thrown, which will be catched by line number 32 and 33. When I'm going to call this method, a new exception, no such element exception will be called. And I'm going to assert, since you have not passed anything to get message, the get message will be null because you have not passed anything to no such element exception. Here no such element exception is not having any message like we had for business exception. There is no message. Can you see any message? No, we can't. So the message will be null. Now if I try to debug this, at line number 47, we are going to throw no such element exception. Hence, when the code comes to line number 23, this mocked repository is going to throw an exception, that is no such element exception. As soon as it has thrown the no such element exception, all these line of code has been ignored and directly the exception comes to this particular no such element exception, because we've explicitly said that whenever find by ID method is called, please throw an exception. And since it is throwing an exception but try catch is there, catch has caught this particular exception and it is going to throw an exception, but the message is null. So if you can go here, I can see that the assert equals message is null. If I go and run it, the JUnit test case is passed. Now if I try to do the code coverage with employee service IMPL test class, let's see how the results will be. As far as I understand, everything should have been covered. One with code, one without code. Both the lines will be covered in this particular case, and even we have handled this. So if you can see, to make it all green, we have created 100% coverage of service IMPL class. Just for these line of code, I have to write 3 test cases. So this much code has to be written for creating the JUnit test case for just these number of line of code. Hence, you should always mock it. Otherwise, you would have keep on calling this find by ID multiple times just for checking your functionality. Now, with this particular thing, not just throwing exception, if a mail would have been sent to client that exception has occurred, then that would be a misleading email. Hence, please do not do that. If anything is going to send an email to your client, mock that also. Now, we have done the JUnit coverage of minimum 80% for service IMPL class. But also we need to cover the controller class. So if you want to know how to cover the controller's JUnit test cases, you have to let me know in the comment section. Then I'll create one session for employee controller, and also I want to cover many things like difference between do return and then return. So not just when and then mantra works, there is also do return, do nothing, and do throw, similar to then throw. What is the difference between them? How do you verify a mock is called? How do you verify a method is called? And when and where should a spy will be used in Mockito? So that is the partial mocking supported by Mockito using spy. How to use that? I'll be doing that in the next video. If you let me know in the comment section. Thank you.